German Chancellor Angela Merkel has announced she is to step down in 2021. So how will Europe, let alone the German nation itself, cope without her? And Sri Lanka has two people claiming to be Prime Minister at the same time. What factors are at play behind the so-called constitutional crisis? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has announced she is stepping down in 2021, bringing an end to a political career which by then will have spanned more than 3 decades. She also said she would not seek re-election in December this year as leader of the centre-right CDU party, a post she's held since the year 2000. The CDU was severely weakened in Sunday's poll in the state of Hesse when it plunged 11 percentage points to 27%, the party's worst showing in the state since 1966. The SPD, which is in coalition with the CDU nationally, fell by similar account to 19.8%. Now it seems the race is already on within the CDU to find her successor as Chancellor, albeit that the position is usually determined in Germany's federal elections, the next of which are provisionally scheduled for 2021. As Chancellor for 13 years, Merkel has been Europe's most powerful leader, a presence so synonymous with stability that Germans call her Mutti, or mother. So what will be the impact of her stepping down, not only within Germany itself, but further afield throughout Europe, not to mention the rest of the world? I'm joined from Tallinn, Estonia, by Florian Hartleb, a research associate of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, and here in Beijing by Professor Cui Hongjian, a senior research fellow and director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, before we go into the discussion, let's first listen to what Merkel says on Monday.
Firstly, at the next CDU party congress in December in Hamburg, I will not put myself forward again as candidate for the CDU chair. Secondly, this 4th term is my last as German Chancellor.
Well, many inside her party have blamed her migrant policy for the rise of the far-right Alternative for Germany, which has become the 3rd largest party in parliament. But others pointed out that in Sunday's election in the state of Hesse, the Conservatives lost more votes to the liberal pro-refugee Green Party rather than to the AfD. So, Professor Cui, what do you think was the main reason for her downfall?
Yes, as we know, it looks like this, the failure in this recent 2 local election would be a direct reason for Merkel's step down. But I think that indeed it's a result of the acceleration of this anticipation from her own party and also her, the coalition party like CSU and also SPD. I think, yes, the refugee and the migration issue would be a very, very big problem for Chancellor Merkel, especially her credibility. I mean, got a lot of damage from this policy. But of course, I think maybe a wider background will give us a very useful understanding about this, about Chancellor Merkel's political career in Europe. Is even German politics, as we know, it's remarkable. It's remarkable with its stability and continuity in the past. But now, I think in the background of a huge change of European politics, it could not be taken outside. I mean, from this general trend.
Okay, well, let's look at that in just a moment. But Florian, let me go to you first. For sure, the immigration, the refugee issue is the issue that really put a lot of pressure and backlash against Merkel for her rule. She never admitted that she made a mistake, but she said that if I could, I would turn back the clock many years to prepare Germany better for the influx of arrivals. So with the ease of hindsight, how do you think she might have coped with the refugee problem differently?
It is a question if there was an alternative in this dramatic political situation in autumn 2015, and Merkel was standing for a humanitarian approach, for the so-called refugee welcome culture, and she tried to figure out a European solution, and he failed with that at the end of the day.
Okay. Also, a very interesting technical factor is that she announced that she will not run for the leadership of the party, but she will stay on to be Chancellor of the country until 2021. So, Professor Cui, she seems to have stepped back from her long-held principle that the leadership of the party and the leadership of the country needs to be one. What does that mean for her for the rest of her term as Chancellor?
Actually, the Chancellor Merkel is very, famous with her, pragmatic, approach to deal with some political challenges. I think at this time, she continued this approach, say that yes, she needed to step down from the leader of the party because he needed to calm down this unsatisfaction from her colleague in the party. But at the same time, as we know, once she leaves from the leader of the government, it will give a lot of uncertainties for the German politics. And also I think that it's also good for Chancellor Merkel and her party to take some more time to give some space for her successor in the party. So I think indeed it will be in the interest of CDU and also in the interest of its partner like SPD.
Well, Germany, as you said, has been a cradle of political stability in Europe over the last decade, but some people are saying now this looks to be over. Florian, do you agree with this prediction? How much do you think will change for Germany, especially with the shift to the right across the continent?
Yeah, it's kind of strange that basically Angela Merkel failed because of the different governmental process. She said on herself that this big coalition, the coalition with the Bavarian party plus the Social Democrats, is not performing very well, and basically she failed because of the internal reasons, and it was her last trial to keep the power, because we should keep in mind that she stays as a chancellor, at least it is her plan, for the next 3 years, and she is hoping to get a successor. It can be only Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer. She is loyal to her, and this is also now the question if she's still very strong and she can keep her line, because she also saw that she failed with her loyal person in the faction, with Mr. Kauder, who was not re-elected as a head of the CDU-CSU faction. And she sees also in Europe that the situation is very difficult to find further developments and solutions in the refugee crisis. The other thing is basically Macron in France is waiting for some reforms in terms of the Eurozone, and there can be that there's a lack of European leadership also in the light of the upcoming European elections in the next May. So we have tough times internally and externally, and nobody really knows what's going on.
At this moment, as you said, much depends on who will be her successor as the party leader. If it is a loyalist, some people are saying that Germany might see a smooth transition to a new chancellor, possibly allowing Merkel to see out her term. But if one of her adversaries prevails as party leader, her chancellorship becomes uncomfortable and possibly unattainable. So, Professor Cui, who are we looking at as front runners, and how tight do you think the race will be?
Yeah, now as we know, there is now the party secretary, a lady who was chosen by Chancellor Merkel as her successor, and also another competitor would be the current, healthy minister in the cabinet, and also another one is from CDU, CSU, parliament coordinator. So yes, I think that no matter who will be the front runner, will be a very big problem is once the successor of Mr. Chancellor Merkel to continue her policy or even a style of politics, it is still, I think, will get some critics from party and from partners. But once somebody who takes some advantage and in criticizing the Chancellor Merkel's policy, perhaps it will raise some opposition from Chancellor Merkel's supporter. So I think it will be a very big dilemma for his successor, no matter who will be.
One of the questions being widely posed is how strongly will her successor position himself or herself on Europe, on the future of Europe, or instead will he or she promote an agenda of reasserting national sovereignty? Florian, how do you see these possible contenders play out in this issue?
I wouldn't say that the situation is too dramatic. It's still a time for a change, because basically we in Germany know that this big coalition is not very popular. But on the other hand, the German economy is doing very, very well. We have a very low unemployment rate at the moment, and also maybe it's good also for this challenge of right-wing populists in Europe, because Merkel was and still is enemy #1 because of her refugee policy, and maybe it is also time now for a regeneration, and as well maybe for a new phase, because as it was said already, Merkel is since 18 years in power of the political party, and since 13 years Chancellor, and maybe it's time now to cope with the future challenges such as digitalization, the change of energy, and coming back from the long-lasting debate on migration.
Merkel's retreat, analysts say, could also mark the beginning of a new era for the European continent. She was a strong supporter of the EU and the Euro. So, Professor Cui, how much will the future of the EU be tied to her successor? Are we going to see much uncertainty there? And how much risk is there for the EU to kind of fall apart because of her departure?
Yeah, I think firstly we need to know how could these people who oppose the European integration to read or to understand Chancellor Merkel's step down. I think that some maybe populist parties will read it as a victory of this departure from the European Union and so on. But of course, I think in short term it will give some more uncertainties for European integration, because as we know, we don't know what's the new policy trend for her successor. Perhaps maybe more sovereign, or more take care more about the German sovereignty, or just a less pro-European like that. But of course, I think that in long term, that Germany will be show its very firm stand on the pro-European side, because as we know, Germany take the biggest economic benefits from a single market.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Many thanks to Florian Hartleb, a research associate of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, and Professor Cui Hongjian, a senior research fellow and director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when I come back, I'll be asking how two different people in Sri Lanka can both believe that they are the rightful Prime Minister. Is it an internal power struggle or external interference? Stay with me. Tens of thousands of supporters of Sri Lanka's deposed Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe have protested in the capital Colombo for a fifth day, with one dead and numerous injured by now. Wickremesinghe has been allegedly involved in a plot to kill the president and a former defense secretary. According to Sri Lanka's President Maithripala Sirisena, the only choice was to dismiss Wickremesinghe and invite his former rival and the country's ex-strongman Mahinda Rajapaksa to take over as Prime Minister. Now, a political crisis arose as Wickremesinghe has called Sirisena's move to sack him unconstitutional and refused to step down. So how did it all begin and what's at stake here? What could be the consequences of having two people claiming to run the government? Joining me on this discussion in the Beijing studio is Atul Aneja, Associate Editor of The Hindu, and Qinduo, Senior Fellow at Pangoal Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, a little bit of a background information for the people who haven't followed it so closely. Now, the turmoil is being called by some as a constitutional crisis. Now, according to the 2015 constitutional amendment, the President does have the power to appoint the Prime Minister, but does that amendment give the President also the power to sack the Prime Minister? Atul, you are shaking your head.
No, I don't think it gives him the power to sack the Prime Minister. It gives him the power to appoint. And the Prime Minister can be removed only under certain other considerations. For example, there is a no confidence motion in the Parliament. It has to be a parliamentary process which has to dismiss or remove the Prime Minister. If it's a question of his death, for example, then that's another reason. So these are very clear-cut, constitutionally clear conditions in which the Prime Minister can be sacked.
Okay.
Can I offer sort of different opinions from from the perspective of the supporters of the president, because look at the government is a coalition, a unity government, the coalition of two parties. On one hand, you have the president and his party, and then the ousted prime minister and his party, right? But now the president basically is withdrawing his support and his party's support of the government, so naturally the government collapsed, and that's why the president said, okay, I'm appointing a new prime minister.
Yeah.
So both sides have their own opinions.
But this is interesting because he's appointing the man, Rajapaksa, whom he defeated 3 years ago in presidential election in 2015. Why is that? Could you help us understand the situation, Qinduo?
Look, the president and the ousted prime minister have been at odds for some time. The only thing in common, the only thing brought them together is actually the common enemy in the former president Rajapaksa, right, when they had this the election back in 2015. But after that, they have problems personally, in terms of personality, in terms of policy making. They don't see eye to eye with each other. And also, the economy is in bad shape. So the president is not happy with the prime minister, and also Rajapaksa is very popular, remains very popular, and his party in the local assembly election, there are 430 seats, and his party won 239, basically 2/3, and that means probably back 2 years later, if there's a presidential election, and Rajapaksa and his party will come back again.
Okay.
So basically, the president is aligning himself with the winner, let's say.
Possible in the future. Now, an article published by the CNBC says that the constitutional crisis could destabilize Sri Lanka, pushing it closer to China, and that it is a win for China. And a few other Western media also mentioned that the Chinese government is one of the few to congratulate Rajapaksa on becoming Prime Minister. So again to you, Qinduo, what is China's position here, and does China support any particular side here?
No. China basically respects the sovereignty of Sri Lanka, every country, including Sri Lanka. Yes, that's happening. We are following that. We are calling for dialogue among different parties to solve their own problems. China is not convening. If China does or did intervene as the Western media described in 2015, probably Rajapaksa will remain the president. No.
Because Rajapaksa is in a very close
relationship. As dealing with China anyway that time for a long time, for 50 years.
But Wickremesinghe, how has his relationship as Prime Minister to China?
At the very beginning of the new government in 2015, the President, the Prime Minister, they went to India at the first overseas trip. Somehow they're shifting their direction from China to India. But later on, because of the close economic relationship with China, so they come to Beijing. And it's the ousted Prime Minister actually who reached the deal over the Hambantota, which is strongly criticized by the Western media, right?
Okay.
Is he, considered pro-China, or the former president considered pro-China? No.
Okay, Atul, what is your comment here?
I don't think there's a clear binary that Rajapaksa, China, Wickremesinghe, India. It's not so straightforward. We're talking about Rajapaksa. Rajapaksa visited India just very recently, and he met Prime Minister Modi and gave a number of interviews to Indian media saying that this impression that he's pro-Chinese is wrong. So is the situation, these are Sri Lanka nationalists, and they care for their country, and these alliances will shift one way or the other. So to say that certain candidates and brand them as something, I think that's being oversimplistic. We've seen the case of Sirisena, for example, supposed to be pro-India, but then later on when the projects came, he went closer to China. So it's difficult to, I think, just brand and label people in this way in terms of the political preferences.
Yeah, I agree. They are leaders of, first of all, leaders of Sri Lanka, not leaders of India or China.
Absolutely.
The interests they consider is national interests of Sri Lanka, not China, not India.
Now, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi just held talks with Wickremesinghe on October the 20th to deepen the historically close relationship between the two countries. So what has been Prime Minister Modi's reaction to the current situation in Sri Lanka?
Modi himself has not reacted, but the Indian Foreign Ministry has said that the rule of law and the constitution of Sri Lanka should be followed in this case.
Okay.
And that's about it. And there is no other statement saying preference for A or B. So in a way, quite similar to China, not directly interfering, or in words in any case, into the internal affairs of Sri Lanka.
The Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka also held talks with different these so-called two prime ministers at the same time. What is the message China wants to send there?
I think for China, it's really about China would prefer stability, would prefer a quick fix of the current issue over there, because I mean, nobody wants to see like a crisis, say, developing in this country. So obviously they are trying to solve their problems. I think China actually holding a similar position with India, because we have a similar relationship with Sri Lanka. We do benefit from a stable Sri Lanka. We do benefit from a successful Sri Lanka.
Well, some people would say, and I would understand it's common sense, that when you have huge investment in a certain country, for instance, in the case of the Hambantota port, for instance, wouldn't it be natural that you don't want to sit back and just watch what happens? Maybe the project really lands in the hands of someone who is very much cautious of China's presence in Sri Lanka. Wouldn't that be, Atul?
I think so. It's natural that we don't want to directly interfere in the internal affairs. That's for Sri Lankans to decide. But there are huge interests in Sri Lanka, and look at the geostrategic position of Sri Lanka. It's it's next to very major sea lanes which are bringing in oil and gas and trade in huge amounts across the Indian Ocean, then Strait of Malacca, and then into the Asia Pacific. So Maldives or Sri Lanka are extremely important pieces in a geostrategic sense. So it will be interest of both India and of China to make sure that their national interests in terms of their trade interests and energy security interests are not compromised. This is for both sides. And I think that brings us to the point that there needs to be a conversation between India and China on whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Maldives, or whether it is Mauritius, or it is other Seychelles, because this waterway is important to both countries, and not only to us two countries. Then once it crosses the Malacca, it's also important for Japan and the Koreas. So we are all stakeholders in the stability of this region, and Sri Lanka is a very important cog in the entire set.
How does China understand the sensitivity of the strategic importance of Sri Lanka, and how does China try to make clear its intention in that region?
Look, for China, if you look at the issue through the Western practice, they would say, with more investment comes probably military relationship, or even, so-called military bases. That's the probably U.S. way or Western European way. But for China, in Chinese perspective, China is not dealing with a particular person or particular government for 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. China is dealing with Sri Lanka as a country for many, many decades to come. So we respect the sovereignty, respect the country's internal affairs policy making by their own leaders, because this is not the first time so-called like a crisis. I mean, Sri Lanka, the politicians, they find a way to solve their problem. They have their own way of dealing with such kind of situation. Let's not panic.
But what kind of proposal does China have to coordinate with countries, for instance, India, in dealing with other South Asian countries? Because after all, there is a lot of traditional relationship that needs to be taken into consideration. Does China have some kind of mechanism so that countries can coordinate?
Yeah, that's I think it's a Wuhan summit, right? Between the two leaders.
That's where we have to go to.
Yeah, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi over there. The proposal is like a 2+1, meaning China, India, plus a third country, co-invest doing the project together, so to maintain the stability, regional stability. So India, China, and the third party will all benefit from such trade and investment. As India would love to see this stable, surrounding area. China too, because China relies on trade heavily.
How has India reacted to such an idea?
Look, this was discussed. The statement which came out of Wuhan summit did not specify 2+1, but did say that India and China must have strategic communication in the region. So the word used was strategic, but as I interpret it, this means just this, that if there is an area of common interest, let India and China first talk to each other and coordinate their positions, and with the third country. There has to be an understanding with a third country. Now, that it is not a trilateral dialogue. It's a 2+1, or the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has said it's China-India plus dialogue. And the Chinese ambassador to New Delhi has talked about this. He says countries like even Iran, for example, should be part of the India-China plus dialogue. And there are Indian scholars who say that why not Africa, which is of common interest both to China and India, that why don't we talk about it and coordinate our positions and see where are the commonalities on which we can work together.
Okay. Well, we have to leave it there. Many thanks for my two guests, Atul Aneja, Associate Editor of The Hindu, and Qinduo, Senior Fellow at the Pangoal Institution. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.